The city never sleeps, but sometimes it forgets to breathe. On that cold November night, the streets pulsed with sirens, headlights, and the endless shuffle of people moving past one another like shadows, never really seeing who they passed. The skyscrapers glistened, their glass facades reflecting the artificial stars of neon billboards, while down below, at street level, reality looked very different. A black girl named Maya walked quickly, clutching a paper bag close to her chest. She was only 17, dressed in a thrift store jacket that had seen better winters. She had just finished her part-time shift at the diner, her hands still smelling faintly of grease and dish soap. Her mother worked double hours at the hospital. Her younger brother was at home alone, waiting for dinner. It wasn't much, just 2 sandwiches in the bag, one for him, one for her. That was all they could afford that night. But fate has a way of writing its own script. As Maya walked under a flickering streetlight, she noticed a figure slumped on the cold concrete. At first glance, he looked like just another homeless man. Dirty coat, scruffy beard, shoes worn down to nothing. People passed him by without turning their heads, as if he were invisible. But something about him stopped Maya in her tracks. It was the way he held his head, slightly tilted back, eyes not shut in defeat but wide open, scanning the world. He wasn't begging. He wasn't holding a cardboard sign. He was just there, sitting in silence, as if testing whether anyone could see him at all. Maya hesitated. Her brother's sandwich was in her hand. Her stomach grumbled, but she ignored it. She looked at the man again, and for a moment, their eyes met. His were sharp, piercing, yet tired in a way she couldn't explain. They weren't the eyes of someone who had given up. They were the eyes of someone who had lived through storms. Without thinking too much, she reached into the bag, pulled out one sandwich, and placed it gently beside him. She whispered a soft prayer in her heart as she turned away. The man didn't move, not at first, but as she walked on, she could feel his gaze burning into her back, following her into the night. That man was not who she thought he was. What Maya didn't know, what no one knew, was that beneath the dirt, beneath the worn jacket, sat Richard Cole, a man who had once been on the front page of Forbes, a man who had walked the corridors of power, shaking hands with presidents and CEOs, a man whose name was engraved in the cornerstones of luxury hotels across the globe. But tonight, he was unrecognizable, dressed as no one, testing the world around him, and Maya had just failed that test, or perhaps she had passed it in a way he never expected. The night swallowed her footsteps as she disappeared into the shadows, while Richard slowly unwrapped the sandwich. It was cold, simple, nothing more than ham and cheese. But as he took the first bite, a flood of memories returned. His own childhood, where food was scarce and kindness even scarcer. He chewed slowly, feeling the weight of what had just happened. For a man who had spent decades drowning in luxury, the taste of that humble sandwich was the most real thing he had felt in years. By the time Maya reached home, she didn't give the encounter much thought. To her, it was just a small act of kindness, one she wasn't even sure mattered. She gave her brother the remaining sandwich, sat quietly, and pushed away her hunger. But somewhere across the city, a decision was already forming in the mind of a man she believed was forgotten by the world. Because Richard Cole wasn't homeless, he was hiding. And Maya had just become the only person in the city who had truly seen him. The following morning, the world carried on, as usual. Office towers lit up. Luxury cars slid through traffic. The rich polished their suits while the poor counted their pennies. Maya went back to school, tired but hopeful. She didn't know that by the time the day ended, her life would be forever changed. By evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, flashing red and gold across the horizon, there was a knock at her door, heavy, deliberate, and loud enough to send a chill through the walls of their small apartment. Her mother froze. Her brother looked confused. Maya stepped forward, cautiously. When she opened the door, her heart dropped. Standing there were 2 uniformed officers, badges gleaming, their faces stern. Behind them, a black luxury car idled at the curb, its tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. They weren't here by mistake. Maya's small act of kindness had stirred a storm she could never have predicted, because sometimes, feeding the wrong man can open doors you never knew existed, doors that lead into worlds of wealth, danger, and secrets buried under layers of power. That sandwich was not just food, it was the spark that lit the fuse. And as the police stepped forward, asking her name, Maya realized that her life, her family's life, was about to collide with something far bigger than she could imagine. The echo of that knock lingered in the air long after it fell silent, heavy, deliberate, as if meant to remind everyone inside that the world outside was not to be ignored. Maya's mother stood frozen by the kitchen sink, water dripping from her hands, while her younger brother peeked nervously from behind her arm. The officers at the door did not flinch, their faces carved in stone, their eyes fixed directly on Maya. In the hallway behind them, the black luxury car remained. The hum of its engine seemed louder than the city noise around it, as though the vehicle itself was holding its breath. Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. She couldn't understand what crime she had committed, what mistakes she had made. She had done nothing more than hand over a sandwich to a man on the street, a simple act of kindness. Yet here stood the police, their presence like a storm pressing against the thin walls of their modest apartment. When she confirmed her name, the taller officer's eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a chill through her veins. Something about this wasn't ordinary police work. They weren't there to arrest her. They weren't there to threaten her. They were there because of someone else, the man she had fed. They asked her to step outside. Her mother protested, but the officers reassured her in hushed, controlled tones. Maya walked into the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the neighborhood watching from behind cracked blinds and half-open doors. The entire block had gone silent, as if the world wanted to see what would happen next. The car door opened, and for the first time, Maya saw him again. Gone was the scruffy coat, the torn shoes, the beard that made him look like a forgotten ghost of the city. In their place was a man transformed, Richard Cole, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark tailored suit that seemed to drink in the streetlight. His eyes, the same sharp, piercing eyes she remembered from the night before, were now framed by authority, wealth, and something else she couldn't quite define. She felt her knees weaken. The officer stepped aside as Richard motioned her toward the car. He didn't smile, didn't offer warmth. He simply observed her, as though studying her reaction. The car's interior glowed with soft light, revealing leather seats, silver fixtures, the unmistakable presence of wealth. This was no ordinary ride. This was a moving throne room. Maya hesitated, but something in his gaze pulled her in. She slid into the back seat, her heart racing faster with every passing second. The door closed. The city outside faded away. Inside, the hum of the car engine wrapped around her like a low growl. Richard leaned back, his fingers laced together, resting calmly in his lap. For several moments, he said nothing. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of tires rolling across uneven asphalt. Maya's mind spun. Why was she here? What could a man like him want from someone like her? The answer came in pieces, revealed not by his words, but by what surrounded her. She noticed the briefcase beside him, half open, revealing documents stamped with seals she didn't recognize. She caught the faint smell of expensive cologne, mixed with something older, cigar smoke, leather, power. And then there were the scars. Thin, almost invisible lines near his wrist, barely noticeable unless the light hit them just right. Scars of someone who had lived through battles the world would never see. Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of someone who never needed to raise it to be heard. He reminded her of the sandwich, of her choice to give away what little she had. He told her he had been watching people for weeks, sitting in alleys, outside restaurants, on sidewalks, invisible yet not blind. Thousands had passed him. Most turned away. Some muttered curses. A few dropped coins as if tossing scraps to a dog. Only one person had stopped, without hesitation, to give something that mattered. Her. Maya tried to absorb his words, but they felt heavy, almost unreal. She didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. The car glided smoothly now, leaving behind the worn-down blocks of her neighborhood, entering streets lined with iron gates, manicured lawns, and homes that looked like palaces. It was a different world, one she had only seen in magazines or on television. As they drove deeper into that world, Richard spoke of wealth. Not the glamorous version people posted on social media, but the hidden side no one wanted to talk about. The isolation, the paranoia, the endless parade of fake friends and loyal enemies. He painted wealth, not as a blessing, but as a burden, a cage made of gold. And as he spoke, Maya realized something. He wasn't simply thanking her, he was testing her. By the time the car stopped, she was staring up at a mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. Stone walls rose high, lit by golden floodlights. The gates closed behind them with a mechanical finality that made her stomach twist. She followed Richard inside. The mansion was a world in itself. Marble floors that reflected the chandeliers above. Walls lined with paintings worth more than her family's entire lifetime of wages. Yet, for all its beauty, the house felt cold, empty. Each step echoed as though no one truly lived there. He led her into a study, where floor-tootling bookshelves loomed like silent guards. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air. A fire burned in the fireplace, but its warmth didn't reach her. Richard sat, gesturing for her to stand in front of him, and then, for the first time, Maya saw him falter. His eyes shifted, just slightly, as if wrestling with something buried deep inside. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together, and confessed something that made her breath catch. The reason he had been on the street, the reason he had chosen to disappear from his empire. Richard Cole, the man whose fortune was once untouchable, was a man under siege, hunted not by poverty, but by betrayal. The police at her door hadn't been there to threaten her. They had been there to protect her. Because by feeding him that sandwich, she hadn't just touched his heart. She had stepped into his world, whether she liked it or not, and his world was dangerous. The fire in Richard's study crackled softly, its orange glow flickering across the walls, but it did little to erase the cold that lingered in the room. Maya stood motionless, her heart racing, as the man before her shifted from a stranger into a confession. Richard leaned back, his gaze heavy with memory. To understand why he had been on the streets, to understand why the police had followed her home, she first needed to know who he truly was. Not the suit, not the mansion, not the wealth etched into every corner of his life, but the man underneath. He spoke of beginnings. Richard Cole had not been born into wealth. He was the son of a steelworker in Detroit, a man who came home every night with hands cracked and scarred from molten heat. His mother cleaned houses for the very people who looked down on them. Their lives were stitched together with resilience, survival, and prayer. As a boy, Richard carried newspapers at dawn, studied under dim streetlights when the electricity was cut, and learned early on that life owed him nothing. His escape was discipline. He ran miles every morning before school, read every book he could borrow, and swore silently that he would never let poverty define him. The military became his proving ground. He enlisted young, carving his path with sweat and silence. There, he learned precision, leadership, and the brutal truth of sacrifice. While others partied, Richard trained. While others complained, he endured. His superiors saw in him what others ignored, the ability to hold the line when everything else collapsed. But Richard wasn't built to follow forever. He had a mind that reached beyond orders, beyond boundaries. When he left the military, he carried with him not only discipline but a hunger for control, for legacy, for a life that could never again be stolen from him. He entered the business world with nothing but determination. He worked tirelessly, often outthinking men who were born into privilege. Deals that seemed impossible, he closed. Risks others feared, he embraced. Within a decade, his name was whispered in corporate halls, and within 2 decades, it was printed on the covers of glossy magazines. Hotels, resorts, and skyscrapers bore his name. The boy from Detroit had built an empire, but wealth is a crown that grows heavier with each jewel. The more Richard gained, the more isolated he became. Friends turned into competitors. Competitors turned into enemies. And family, the people, who should have been his foundation, became the first to sharpen their knives. Richard's voice grew lower as he spoke of betrayal. His brother, the one he had paid through college, had siphoned money from one of his companies. Trusted advisors forged contracts that bled him of millions. A woman he once believed he loved had used him as a ladder, climbing higher only to disappear when she reached the top. But the worst betrayal was not in theft or deceit. It was in silence. As Richard grew wealthier, he realized people stopped telling him the truth. Everyone smiled, everyone agreed, everyone obeyed. He became a king in a kingdom of liars, a man surrounded not by friends but by shadows. And that, he admitted, was lonelier than poverty had ever been. But so, he tested the world. Disguised in rags, Richard left behind his boardrooms and bodyguards. He walked among the people he had once been part of. He sat on sidewalks, he listened to conversations of strangers who had no idea who sat beside them. For weeks, he became invisible by choice, waiting to see if anyone could look past the dirt and see the man. Almost no one did, until Maya, her sandwich, simple and small, had been more than food. It was proof that humanity still existed, even when the world was blind. But with that proof came danger, because Richard's enemies had not stopped hunting him. They wanted his empire. They wanted his silence. And by crossing paths with him, Maya had been pulled into a war she could not see. Maya's breath caught as his words sank in. She was standing in a palace of marble and gold, listening to a man whose life was a study in contradictions, strength and fragility, triumph and loss, wealth and emptiness. She saw the scars not just on his skin, but on his soul. He turned his gaze on her, sharp and unyielding. "Kindness is a light," he said, "but light attracts shadows." Maya shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth of it. The police who had knocked on her door were not ordinary officers. They were Richard's private security, disguised to protect rather than intimidate. Her act of kindness had placed her name on a list of people who mattered to a man powerful enough to make empires rise and fall. But what did it mean for her? For her family? Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her with unnerving clarity. He spoke of his enemies, of the forces that lurked in the shadows of wealth, corporations that wanted his contracts, politicians who feared his influence, families with fortunes older than the nation itself who despised the fact that a black man from Detroit had climbed higher than them all. They were waiting for a weakness, and Maya, in her innocence, had just become one. Silence hung in the room, like smoke. Maya's mind spun in circles. She was only 17, barely managing school, work, and survival. She had no place in this world of marble floors and golden cages. And yet, in one act of compassion, she had stepped into the storm. The fire crackled louder, as if punctuating the weight of the moment. Richard's eyes softened, just slightly. He told her something then that felt less like a warning and more like a confession. Despite his empire, despite his power, despite the millions in his accounts, he had never felt truly seen. Until a girl with nothing had given him something. Money could not buy a sandwich. A choice, a reminder that even kings can be hungry, and even strangers can be family. Maya stood in silence, the enormity of it all pressing down on her. She didn't know if she had stumbled into a blessing or a curse, but one thing was certain, her life was no longer ordinary. Because once you are noticed by a man like Richard Cole, the world will never look at you the same again. And as the firelight danced in his eyes, she realized that this was only the beginning. The crown was heavy. The enemies were close, and the shadows were moving. The mansion was quiet, but silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means danger is already at the door. That night, Maya could not sleep. She lay in one of the guest rooms, its walls covered with gold art and heavy curtains that shut out the city lights. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever known, but it did not bring comfort. Instead, her thoughts raced about her mother and brother, about the sandwich, about the man who had pulled her into a world she could never have imagined. Somewhere across the hall, Richard Cole sat awake in his study, staring at documents spread across his desk. His face was lit only by the glow of the fireplace and the faint reflection of city lights through the tall windows. He was a man who had everything yet carried himself as if it could all vanish tomorrow, and perhaps it could, because while Maya tried to make sense of her new reality, Richard's enemies were already moving. It began with whispers, insider leaks to journalists, unsigned letters slipped under doors, cryptic threats etched into contracts. Then came the more obvious moves, hostile takeovers of smaller companies. In his network, sudden withdrawals from banks, allies who vanished without explanation. These were not random attacks, they were coordinated. Someone was tightening the noose, using power, money, and politics as their weapons. Richard's empire was a fortress, but even fortresses can be breached from within. At dawn, Maya was startled, awake by raised voices echoing through the marble halls. She crept out of her room and followed the sound to a side chamber, where Richard stood with two of his most trusted men. They wore tailored suits, but their postures were rigid, their hands never straying far from their waists. These were not ordinary assistants. These were soldiers in different uniforms. The discussion was heated. Richard's enemies had found a way to infiltrate one of his hotels, a fire set in the basement, disguised as an accident. Insurance papers were being contested. Millions were at stake. But more than money, it was a message. We can reach you. We can touch what you built. Richard noticed Maya standing quietly at the edge of the room. He didn't send her away. Instead, he allowed her to hear it all. Perhaps knowing that once you step into the shadows of power, shielding you from the truth is more dangerous than the truth itself. Her stomach tightened. She realized the sandwich hadn't just made her visible to him, it had made her visible to them. Later that day, Richard took her into the city. Not to the polished towers of finance or the pristine lobbies of his hotels, but to the cracks in between, the alleys where deals were struck in whispers, the offices where papers carried more blood than any weapon. He wanted her to see the world as it was, not as people pretended it to be. He told her of the old families, men born with wealth flowing through their veins like inherited bloodlines. They despised him for climbing higher than they believed he deserved. He told her of competitors, billionaires who wore smiles in public but waged silent wars behind boardroom doors. And he told her of politicians, those who bowed in the spotlight but sharpened knives in the dark. Maya listened, her chest tightening with every word. She had grown up believing wealth was freedom, money was safety, success was the end of struggle. Now she understood. Wealth only changed the battlefield. Poverty starved at the body. Wealth starved the soul. But the storm wasn't just around Richard. It was creeping closer to her. That evening, as the car pulled back toward the mansion, Maya noticed a black SUV trailing behind them. Its windows were tinted, its license plate unmarked. Richard noticed too. He didn't flinch. He gave no sign of alarm, but his driver made a sudden turn, then another, weaving through the city like a man who had rehearsed such maneuvers countless times. The SUV followed. For several tense minutes, the streets blurred, lights flashing, horns blaring, tires screeching against the asphalt. Maya clutched the seat, her breath shallow. Finally, with one last sharp turn, the driver cut down a narrow alley. The SUV slowed at the entrance, lingered, then rolled away. Silence filled the car, but it wasn't relief, it was warning. Richard's eyes caught hers in the dim glow of the interior. In them she saw not fear, but certainty. This was no coincidence. His enemies were watching. That night, Richard doubled the security around the mansion. Guards patrolled the grounds. Cameras were checked. Yet, even with all the layers of protection, Maya could feel the unease in the air. Wealth built walls, but enemies built ladders. She wandered the halls before bed, the echo of her footsteps following her. Every painting, every chandelier, every polished surface seemed to whisper the same truth. This is not safety. This is the front line. And as she passed by the study, she heard Richard's voice once again. low but heavy. He was on the phone, his words sharp, his tone unyielding. He was warning someone, or perhaps threatening them. His empire was at war, and she had been drafted into it without her consent. When she finally lay in bed, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Her family still lived in that small apartment, unaware of the storms circling them. What if the enemies went after them instead? What if kindness had not saved a man, but cursed her family? She stared at the ceiling, her eyes burning with tears, and in that moment she realized something chilling. The sandwich had been a test. Yes, but it had also been a choice that had pulled her into a world of wealth and shadows. And now, whether she liked it or not, she was part of Richard's story. But stories like his did not end peacefully. They ended in battles, and sometimes in blood. Storms do not always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they arrive in silence. It was a Friday morning when everything finally collided. The mansion, usually alive with the quiet hum of order, felt strangely heavy. Guards stood tighter, movements sharper. The staff spoke less, eyes darting toward the windows as if they expected something. Even the air seemed to wait, holding its breath. Richard Cole sat in the great hall, the morning sun stretching long shadows across the marble floor. His suit was immaculate, but his face carried the weight of battles fought in shadows. Maya sat across from him, unsure if she belonged in this world, unsure if she could ever escape it again. Then the knock came. Not at the front gate, where guards controlled entry, not at the side door, where deliveries slipped in. This knock came directly at the mansion's great oak doors. 3 heavy thuds that reverberated through the halls. When the doors opened, it wasn't business rivals or faceless enforcers. It was the police. 3 officers, uniforms, crisp faces, unreadable. Behind them, black SUVs lined the driveway, their flashing lights muted by the daylight. Richard did not rise. He did not flinch, but his empire trembled. They came with papers, warrants, accusations of fraud, whispers of bribes, financial documents twisted into weapons. To the world, this was law. But Maya, watching from the staircase, understood. This was war. His enemies had chosen their battlefield, and they had chosen it well. The mansion was searched. Rooms that once carried luxury now carried suspicion. Officers rifled through drawers, pulled open safes, and confiscated documents. Every corner felt invaded. Every shadow betrayed. Through it all, Richard remained calm. His silence was louder than any protest. His stillness was defiance. Maya stayed close, but fear wrapped around her ribs. She had thought danger would come, with bullets, with dark alleys, and broken glass. Instead, it came with signatures and badges. Wealth had built him an empire, but it had also painted a target on his back. By evening, the police were gone, leaving behind a mansion that looked the same but felt broken. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers hung open, the air thick with the residue of power violated. Maya found Richard in his study, staring into the fire. His face was hard, his eyes distant, as though he was seeing beyond the flames. She wanted to ask if he was all right, but the words froze in her throat, because she already knew the answer. He was not all right. He had not been all right for a long time. The storm had broken, and it was only beginning. The following days blurred into one another. News stations ran headlines about investigations. Commentators speculated about his empire crumbling. Rivals smiled in boardrooms, already circling like vultures over what they believed would be his remains. Yet, through the chaos, Richard did not disappear. He still moved with precision, still commanded respect, still made decisions that could shift millions. But Maya could see the cracks. She could see the man behind the armor. One evening, he called her into the study. The fire burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the bookshelves. He did not speak of business. He did not speak of wealth. Instead, he spoke of the day she had handed him that sandwich. He told her that kindness had been the last thing he expected. The last thing anyone had offered him without strings. In a world where every handshake hid a knife, her small act had been a mirror, reminding him of something he had buried long ago. The memory of being hungry. The memory of being invisible. The memory of being just a man before the billions and the enemies and the walls. Her kindness had not saved him. It had reminded him he was still human. Maya listened, tears pressing against her eyes. She had thought she was the one whose life had changed that day. She had not realized his life had changed too. But enemies do not disappear because of memories. And kindness does not erase the cost of power. The breaking point came one night, when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up outside the mansion gates. This time, they were not police. They were rivals, dressed in tailored suits, but carrying the weight of violence in their steps. They came not with papers, but with threats. Maya watched from the upstairs balcony as Richard met them at the gates. Words were exchanged, sharp, heavy, laced with venom. Though she could not hear them, she could feel the stakes in the air. This was not about money anymore. It was about dominance, survival. For nearly an hour, the confrontation unfolded. Men with too much power trying to break the will of the man who had climbed too high. And when it ended, Richard stood alone at the gates, the SUVs rolling away. Into the night, he had won the battle. But the war was endless. The next morning, Maya packed her bag. She could not stay. The mansion was not safety. The wealth was not freedom. And Richard's enemies would never forgive, never stop, never allow her to remain invisible. She had stepped into a world built on shadows, and she had seen too much. As she stood by the great doors, Richard appeared. He did not ask her to stay. He did not beg or plead. He simply looked at her, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them, and in that silence, she understood. Kindness had connected them, but it could not chain her to his war. She stepped outside. The city waited. The air felt heavy, but it was hers again. Years later, Maya would still remember him, not as the billionaire in the headlines, not as the man whose empire was always at war. She remembered him as the stranger she had once handed a sandwich to a man dressed as nobody, who turned out to be somebody. She remembered the lesson he had given her without words. Wealth is not freedom. Power is not peace. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can pierce through walls higher than money can build. But kindness does not erase the storm. It only lights a candle in the darkness. However, briefly. And for Richard Cole, the candle was all he had left.